Brittle points are a very important psychological phenomena to understand. And it's that feeling and phenomena where things are going, there's a little bit of discomfort, and then something snaps. And you try and go back, snap back into normal position, and the biology will not let you enter that domain. In other words, there has been such a grief, such an exhaustion or trauma that's built up over time that you cannot return, that we cannot return to center, to the way things were before. Something snaps. And the first thing I want to mention is a little piece of metal. You know, when you have a piece of steel a few millimeters thick, bend it. You can bend it. If you have a narrow nail, you can bend it. And it goes up and it goes down, and every single time you bend it, it gets slightly easier to bend, and so you bend it some more. And it becomes almost second nature, and then one day it snaps. Because a piece of steel, they do studies in airplanes for airplane vibrations, etc. It has a fatigue factor. It can bend so many times and then it's done. Well, there are things of an emotional nature that have a fatigue factor, of a psychological nature that have a fatigue factor. And I want to talk about how they emerge and, you know, what causes them on a cultural level, and, you know, what we can do to avoid these snap points as a culture. So the first thing to understand with these snapping phenomena is they're usually a bit of a surprise to at least someone. Sometimes it's the instigator. You know, let's say a partner cheats on a marriage and then repents, cheats on a marriage and then repents, cheats on a marriage and then they can't repent. The love has died. And it's like, wait a minute, it worked before, and what? I thought this was okay. I thought I repent and then this is okay. And so there's usually a little bit of a surprise on at least one of the parties. But it is not a surprising thing. So the first thing to understand is that if there is surprise, we're dealing with a blind spot that's cultural. These things are very obvious if you're looking, just like it's very obvious if you've had a little experience bending metal, that at some point, someone that deals with metal a lot will feel it's getting easier and easier, the seam is getting thinner and thinner, and it's going to break in a few times. And if you don't want that to happen, you stop fiddling with it. Like so many things, it's easier not to break something than it is to repair it. You know, to stop bending the steel at a certain point might take discipline, but it's a lot easier than getting that steel reforged or drilling holes and bolting it back together again. Now, the fact that it's a surprise means there's a blind spot. The fact that there's a blind spot means there's a disrespect. Respect, to keep looking, to look, spect, and look again, respect, to keep in attunement. You respect something when you see it and you attune to it. So if you see metal is beginning to break or love is beginning to break and you stop and you do the opposite, that's respect, assuming you want the love to survive. This also, of course, happens with trauma, and it happens with rage, and it happens with collapses into helplessness and exhaustion. There's this constant process of straining and bending a system, and then it somehow snaps. Now, when something is not respected, when it's not honored, then we're going to violate it. And the connection between violation and violence is very tight. It's a tight connection because it's kind of as if this finger was standing out in the road in a culture that cannot see fingers, in a world where the eyes that would look at the fingers don't exist, either because they're all pointing up or whatever. But cars keep driving over this finger, and it gets more and more bloodied. And at some point, there's a snap. There's a reaction. Now, this is not a surprise, of course, in a world where someone can see fingers. If someone sees fingers and a single person sees a single car drive over this finger, they're going to say, oh, my God, stop the car, get your finger out of the way, because there's respect. There's a response to what's being seen. But in a culture that doesn't see fingers or that doesn't look in that area for fingers, there's going to be no response. And this is where it gets dangerous, because in Western culture, we are very much focused on the shoulds of emotion. In a certain sense, we try and do something rather odd with the scientific instrument that is the heart. Starting at a very young age, we expose children to traumatic, uncomfortable, violating experiences. The 10 to 20% of the population that's highly sensitive, we overstimulate them. We do a whole host of things that are profoundly uncomfortable and that block the development of that human being. Whether it's giving them alcohol so they'll sleep, too much sugar, sticking them in front of TVs and video games to capture their attention so that we can do other things. There's a lot going on that we don't want to deal with. As a culture, we don't want to deal with it. We've created a culture that has the nuclear family, so there's no grandparents and great-grandparents and uncles and stuff to hold the child, which creates then in a dual work family the certainty that that child is going to be disposed, because not only is it a dual work household in many cases, but it's in a culture that through the nature of materialism, through the nature of the deification of money and the devaluing in many ways of human relationships, the devaluing of emotion, a parent who's asked to choose between the presence. You see a parent in a materialistic culture that's asked to choose between rushing to the hospital to fix a broken leg of their child or going to work on time is most likely going to rush to the hospital. We don't look kindly on parents that are on time for work appointments and say, oh, by the way, I left my child with a broken leg because I'm professional and I want to be on time. But I left my child with a broken heart. I left my child in trauma. I left my child feeling helpless and addicted. I left my child in an unsafe environment. That's a lot more socially acceptable, particularly when we maintain the veil of cultural ignorance. We don't teach parenting classes. We don't teach about trauma. We don't teach about the correlation of trauma and addiction. We don't teach about the correlation of pain management and addiction, the correlation between pain management and trauma. We are an emotionally illiterate culture. And so when you do things and then we overlay stereotypes, so not only do we not attune, but then we overlay stereotypes on our children. Boys, it's not a big deal. Don't cry. In other words, we have all these shoulds about feelings. Boys, apparently, in this culture, just want to have sex if you listen to the stereotypes. But it's interesting because if you look deeply into the complexity, one of the addictions of emotional pain management is sex. And so the very stereotype that boys just want to have sex and that children's personal experiences don't matter, we don't remember our own childhood, etc., and we just got to get it through it, and it's all about the parent, and of course work comes before child raising and all that, and all the ripple effects from that, from underpaid teachers to shipping off to the lowest priced grade school or preschool, or the preschool that focus on academics rather than teaching emotional literacy. So there's all these different ripple effects from these stereotypes, these paradigms about what boys are, what girls are. And so these create blind spots. So it's possible as an American boy to first of all be shamed and addicted and punished, from literally beating or hitting a child for expressing emotions at an awkward time. Hitting, beating, punishing a child for expressing the actual feelings they feel. Then overlaid with the stereotype that boys don't cry, boys don't have feelings. So you attack the actual feeling. Then you traumatize the child, in this case a boy, which creates profound levels of loneliness and helplessness. And then rather than address that loneliness and helplessness, create an overlay on that child that says, you don't have feelings, so your original feelings don't exist because my needs are more important than yours. Creation of the feeling of loneliness. I'm alone here. I'm not being taken care of. I'm being used and manipulated. Then being violated and traumatized to an elevated state. And then rather than that being dealt with, now we're looking at a cover-up with a stereotype. I don't want to see you. I want to see a stereotype that makes me feel comfortable with my behavior and me feel comfortable with the status quo, so I don't have to look at your feelings, which means I don't have to look at my impact on you, which means you don't exist. Well, this creates still more loneliness and more feelings. But then they don't exist either because boys don't have feelings. And then when there's the smallness or the shyness, etc., around that, then you're just odd. Like, why would you possibly do that? In other words, once you've erased the basis for all feelings, now there's a perfect cover to act befuddled. Like if you say, I violated my child, then I traumatized my child, then I told them they didn't exist, and then I told them the loneliness they feel about that doesn't exist also, then why you would feel small and helpless is completely understandable. But when all of that is disrespected, it's not looked at, and it's certainly not stayed in attunement, now it creates this feeling of shame, of smallness, of helplessness, of hurt. But then, rather than say, well, that's about me and my behavior, that's about this culture, I have a weird boy. Oh, well, he'll grow out of it. Well, that's also a disrespect because he's not going to grow out of it unless the behavior changes. And the behavior won't change if it's not acknowledged in its impact, and its impact doesn't exist in this facade that boys don't have feelings. Now, we're wrapping this boy up in more and more invisibility. And at some point, the boy is going to enter the sociopathic area of the brain, the reptilian brainstem, to cope with the fact that the more emotions that he goes into, the more painful they will be. The more painful the emotions are, the more comfort and a sense of belonging and presence is needed to be with that pain together. Trauma needs support circles. But when that support circle doesn't come, because the denial of the wound is there, then the boy will enter the sociopathic arena of their brain where they don't feel it's a strategic looking. Oh, I remember how this game is played. If I cry, I get punished for crying, so I'm going to do this instead. So it's an adaptive personality to a sociopathic environment. Sociopathic environments create sociopathic children. Sociopathic children grow into sociopathic adults who create sociopathic environments for more abused children. And so we have this snapping, dynamic which begins in these layers of fog and befuddlement that are then further made invisible because everyone is in collusion to maintain the status quo. So, you have 5 or 6 glum-looking boys, or they're running around in a hyperactive state to try and feel with adrenaline what they can't feel with and deal with their hearts. And there's one person who's having a feeling, and people look at him as if they're odd. So then you've got compounded attention, like, what's wrong with you? Do you belong? That person's a little bit odd. That person isn't going to help you get, your sense of fitting in and being normal to meet your sense of belonging. So then there's a further disincentive to be anomalous, certainly in that area, and certainly to talk about the taboo areas in the culture that, as a parent group, we're committed to avoiding. Now, this, as a child grows up in this environment, now they develop a self-image that matches the programming, because they've entered their sociopathic area of the brain where they have less and less feelings and more strategy. Manipulation is a key thing. Mom likes it when I lie and say this, and if I lie and say this, I get to play my video game, which numbs my pain. So I'm an addict now. So I'm going to lie, give Mom her little hit, then she'll give me my drug, and we cohabitate in a drug dispensary protocol. I'll give you yours, you give me mine, we cohabitate. I won't tell you the truth that you're not able and willing to hear. And so you have now an invisibility protocol, because as the child grows up and has this image of not being feeling, now they're disconnected from the feelings that are there but are numbed. Meaning when you enter the sociopathic area of one's brain, the feelings in the emotional centers of the brain remain, but they're frozen. And it's very much like going to the dentist and having your gum frozen with Novocaine. When your gum is frozen with Novocaine, you can't feel the pain. So you can stick a pin in and another pin in. It's like, oh, there's no pain. But at some point, the pain will wear off, number one. And number two, even if you don't numb or unfreeze the pain, and so you're still numb, at a certain point of poking holes in the cheek, back and forth, hole, the skin is actually going to fall apart. When you open your mouth one day, the whole skin rips because there's not enough time for healing. There's too much abuse. It's like, how did that happen? I didn't feel anything. And I wasn't looking because men don't have feelings. And so it's when things snap sometimes it's a snap when the dam breaks and the numbness wears off and there's the sense, oh my gosh, for the last 20 years, my mother's been putting pins into my mouth. And I've been putting up with it, something I started at age 2, because in our collusion, I don't have emotions. Okay. So then one day, Mom's sticking a pin in, and the cheek opens up. And both don't quite know what's going on. But there's a reaction. And sometimes the reaction is there's a reaction, and then it dawns on us that our abuser is so, or our dishonorer, the one that's not seeing what's going on or showing any interest, is so dissociative that they'd rather do nothing and just pretend this has nothing to do with them. And so that's the snap. So the skin opens up. It's one too many pokes. And it dawns on us that there's a connection. But it doesn't dawn on the abuser that's doing the poking. And we realize there's a betrayal in that. And we make the connection that if this abuser just has their way, we'll die. Because once this cheek has been torn open, then it'll go over to this one, and they're just going to hammer away until we're dead. And sometimes that's the trauma that leads to the snapping. It's too much. So this is the terrain of something snapping. And it's an important phenomena to be aware of, because one of the ways that we as abuse survivors enable this phenomena is by continuing the lies that we were asked to tell as children about how we feel. So, we don't like loud music, but Dad does. And he punishes us and gives us a lecture every time he turns up loud music and we say we don't like it. So we go into the sociopathic area of the brain. We learn the manipulative coping mechanism. Dad says, how do you like the music? Oh, I love the music. And then we get a smile because we've played along. We no longer exist. Our preferences don't exist. Dad now gets the benefit of playing the loud music, having companionship, tormenting his child, and feeling good about it because the child is hiding the torment. So Dad's got everything that he wants, so he's going to smile to encourage that protocol, as opposed to he has to turn his music down or switch to something childlike or go and play with the child, which he doesn't want to do. So we learn to lie, and we get rewarded for lying. And then we're 50 years old, and a partner says, how do you like this music? And we say, oh, it's great, it's great. And the partner, if we care about our partner, says, well, if it's so great, why do you have such a glum expression on your face? No, it's fine, it's great, just do whatever you want to do. In other words, the child's looking for the smile. Be patted on the back for fulfilling the abuse contract of lying. And most of our partners will say, great, an easygoing partner who's, loves our music, wonderful, wonderful. And then 2 years into the marriage, something snaps. I hate that music. Get it off. It's like, where did this come from? You were so easygoing. Nothing seemed to faze you before we got married. Now you actually exist as a person. Yes, I exist, and I've always hated that song. It's like, well, there's a certain sense, and it's one of the reasons certain things drop into place in a marriage, a certain sense that if I have to put up with this for the rest of my life, then, or now that I'm married, now I'm equal and now I get to have a voice, and it turns out that all the reasons you married me are things that I hate. Or it starts turning towards passive aggressive. Like I say I love it, but you're supposed, if you really loved me, to get that I hate it. I'm then supposed to get the perks of saying I loved it, and then you're supposed to prove that you really love me by knowing that I don't, and then you're supposed to change, and you didn't. You just did what I said. I said I loved that music. You kept playing it. I knew I hated it. For some reason, I just knew it wasn't okay to actually tell my husband or my wife the truth, and now it's exploded. And we're angry at them, for not picking up the lie. And they're angry at us for setting us up to say, you're marrying this person when you're marrying this person. So pulling off these abuse cycles of lies is one of the single most kind and powerful things that you can do in a marriage. But when that is not done, there will be a on and on and on, and the sex dries up, and then the coldness sits in, the hostility. It's like, you really love this music and you can't stand, yeah, I love the music. You really, and then it explodes. At some point, the lie is unsustainable. But there's a child in there holding on to the lie desperately because that lie kept them alive. Because the feeling of being hated and dad being disgusted with them because they didn't like heavy metal or whatever it was as a child is so devastating to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. So devastating that they couldn't face it, and they didn't have a mature father who was capable of transcendence, capable of meeting their own needs and then moving through that to be in service to the child.